There comes a point in everyone's life when you look in the mirror and realize the person looking back isn't exactly who you thought you'd become. It's not always failure that follows you. Sometimes it's a quiet feeling that something essential is missing, a disconnect between who you are and who you could have been. That moment, that mix of awareness and unease, is where self-transformation truly begins. Because before anything changes on the outside, it starts as a quiet revolution within. We often imagine change as an event, a decision, a breakthrough, a turning point. But real transformation is a process. It's dismantling old ways of thinking and rebuilding the mind from within. It's not just doing different things, it's seeing the world through a new lens. And that kind of deep internal shift doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds slowly, often through struggle, self-doubt, and moments of honest reflection that most of us try hard to avoid. Psychologists have studied this for decades. Eric Voss called it individuation, integrating the scattered parts of yourself into a whole. Daniel Ryan described it as the journey towards self-actualization, unfolding your full potential once your basic needs are met. But beyond the terms and theories, the truth is simple. Transformation begins when the pain of staying the same finally outweighs the fear of change. Most people never consciously reach that point. They go through life repeating old patterns, running emotional software they picked up in childhood. Their choices are guided by invisible scripts, beliefs formed by family, culture, or early experiences. Those beliefs become psychological, walls that quietly define what they think is possible. I'm not good enough. People like me don't succeed. It's too late to start over. They sound harmless, but they become the invisible architecture of a life. The psychology of transformation begins the moment we start to question those walls. Not tearing them down right away, just noticing them. Awareness, as simple as it sounds, is the first act of rebellion against a conditioned mind. Because once you see the pattern, you can no longer be fully controlled by it. Researchers studying neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, have found something remarkable. Every time you consciously challenge an old belief or behavior, your brain begins to change its wiring. New neural pathways form, old ones fade. The brain isn't a fixed map. It's a living landscape that adapts to your thoughts and experiences. In scientific terms, transformation is neurobiological construction. You are physically reshaping your mind when you choose differently, think differently, and act differently. But here's the paradox. Most people want transformation without discomfort. They want the reward of change without the friction that makes it possible. Yet psychologically, discomfort isn't a sign you're failing. It's a sign your brain is being pushed out of its predictable pathways. It's the old self losing control. Your ego resists because its job is to maintain stability. That's why growth often feels like chaos. Your inner system is clinging to familiarity, even when that familiarity is suffocating you. If you've ever tried to change your habits, waking up earlier, eating better, thinking more positively, you've felt this resistance. It's not just laziness. It's your brain protecting its identity. Cognitive scientists call this homeostasis, the psychological mechanism that keeps your sense of self consistent. When you act in ways that don't align with who you believe you are, your mind feels discomfort and tries to restore the old balance. That's why real transformation doesn't begin with new habits. It begins with a new self-concept. The identity must shift before the behavior can sustain itself. Think about it. If you see yourself as disorganized, you might clean your room once or twice, but your brain will find its way back to chaos. If you believe you're bad with money, you might save for a week, then unconsciously sabotage it. But when you start to say, "I'm the kind of person who takes care of my space," or "I'm learning to manage money wisely," your mind begins to align with a new image. And once the identity shifts, the behavior becomes natural, not forced. Transformation, then, is an identity project disguised as self-improvement. Every meaningful change, from breaking addictions to healing relationships, begins with redefining who you believe yourself to be. This is why therapy, journaling, and introspection work. They make the unconscious visible. They help you see the hidden beliefs shaping your life. And once something hidden is seen, it loses much of its power. But the process is rarely a straight line. In fact, most people who go through deep change describe it as a cycle: progress, doubt, regression, clarity, and renewal. This mirrors the classic hero's journey, where the individual must first leave the comfort of the familiar, face inner trials, and eventually return transformed. Psychology confirms this pattern. Transformation often includes what's known as a liminal phase, the uncertain, uncomfortable space between who you were and who you're becoming. It's absolutely necessary, because without this space, there's no room for rebirth. What's fascinating is that the brain mirrors this cycle. When you enter this phase, say, by quitting a job, ending a relationship, or confronting old trauma, your brain's default mode network becomes more active. This is the region associated with self-reflection and your narrative identity. It's your brain's way of rewriting your personal story. And every new story you tell about yourself, if repeated and emotionally charged, begins to embed itself neurologically as your new truth. So when people say you become what you believe, they're not speaking metaphorically. They're describing a measurable psychological process. Belief isn't just a thought. It's a pattern of neural firing, repeated enough times to feel true. And the only way to change it is through conscious repetition, emotional reinforcement, and new experiences that prove to the brain the old pattern no longer defines reality. Here's the catch, and it's where most transformation journeys fail. People often try to transform through sheer willpower, forcing new behaviors while holding on to old identities. They say, "I want to be confident," but still secretly see themselves as insecure. They try to act strong while internally believing they're weak. The subconscious doesn't buy the performance. It knows the old script too well. That's why transformation requires truth before effort. You can't become someone new while lying to yourself about who you currently are. Radical honesty is the foundation of transformation, not the kind that shames or punishes, but the kind that gently exposes the real state of your inner world. Here's what I feel. Here's what I've avoided. Here's what still hurts. That kind of self-honesty breaks the psychological defenses that keep you trapped in old patterns. It's the equivalent of cleaning a wound, painful at first, but necessary for healing. And when you reach that level of honesty, something shifts. You stop trying to change from a place of self-rejection and start evolving from a place of self-understanding. That's a crucial distinction. Most self-help advice fails because it's built on the assumption that you need to fix yourself. But psychological transformation isn't about fixing. It's about integration. It's about accepting the parts you've disowned and learning to work with them instead of against them. For example, let's say someone struggles with procrastination. On the surface, they might believe they just need more discipline. But beneath that, procrastination often hides fear. Fear of failure, fear of success, or fear of judgment. When that fear is acknowledged with compassion instead of shame, the behavior starts to dissolve because the mind no longer needs to protect itself through avoidance. In that sense, transformation is not self-attack. It's self-reconciliation. That's also why emotional awareness is a cornerstone of lasting change. You can't transform what you refuse to feel. Emotions are signals, data from the subconscious about what's misaligned or unhealed. Anger might signal boundaries being crossed. Sadness might point to loss or unmet needs. Anxiety might reveal the uncertainty between the old self and the emerging one. When you learn to interpret those emotions instead of suppressing them, you begin to move through them instead of being trapped by them. In recent psychological studies, mindfulness and self-compassion have been shown to accelerate transformation by reducing the brain's threat response. When you approach your own discomfort with curiosity rather than judgment, the amygdala, the brain's fear center, calms down. This opens access to the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for reasoning, decision-making, and long-term growth. In simple terms, kindness toward yourself literally expands your capacity to change. The most profound transformations happen quietly, not in grand declarations, but in the subtle moments when you catch yourself choosing differently. You pause before reacting. You breathe before speaking. You say no when you used to say yes out of fear. Each of those moments is a psychological micro-revolution. They rewire the self. And when enough of them accumulate, the old identity simply fades, replaced by something truer, freer, and more aligned with who you are meant to become. Still, we rarely notice transformation as it happens. It's only when you look back that you realize how far you've come. The conversations you no longer tolerate, the thoughts that no longer dominate you, the pain that no longer defines you, these are all markers of change. The person you are now would be unrecognizable to your past self. And that's the quiet miracle of self-transformation. It's not a single moment of awakening, but the gradual realization that you've outgrown an old version of yourself without even trying to destroy it. And yet, there's always more to uncover. Transformation doesn't end. It evolves. Every time you expand into a new identity, life presents another threshold, another layer of the self waiting to be integrated. Growth never asks for perfection, only participation. The mind resists, the heart wavers, but something within you keeps moving forward, drawn by the faint but undeniable pull of becoming. What most people misunderstand about transformation is that it's not just about self-discipline or motivation. It's about awareness. An awareness so honest that it begins to dissolve illusion. Because when you see clearly, when you see the real mechanics of your mind, the fears, the narratives, the defenses, you gain freedom. Not the kind of freedom that makes everything easy, but the kind that lets you choose differently consciously, even when it's hard. There's a psychological phenomenon called cognitive dissonance, the discomfort you feel when your actions and beliefs don't align. Most people resolve this discomfort by changing their actions back to match their old beliefs. But those who truly transform do the opposite. They let the discomfort stay long enough for it to force their beliefs to evolve. They endure that in-between phase, where nothing feels certain, where you're too aware to go back, but not yet confident enough to move forward. That's where the real work happens. That's where transformation hardens into identity. In that sense, self-transformation isn't a single event. It's a constant negotiation between who you were and who you're becoming. Each day presents a subtle invitation to respond differently, to think differently, to perceive differently. Sometimes you fail. Sometimes you fall back into old habits. But even then, you're not starting from zero, because awareness doesn't unlearn itself. Once you've seen truth, it lingers. It whispers in the background of your choices until you listen again. One of the most overlooked aspects of transformation is environment. We like to imagine that willpower alone can override everything. But in reality, our surroundings, the people we talk to, the content we consume, the places we spend time in all reinforce who we believe we are. Psychologically, your environment mirrors your identity. If you're trying to become more creative but spend your time around cynicism, your brain receives conflicting signals. The external world constantly reminds you of the old self you're trying to leave behind. That's why psychologists studying behavioral change emphasize the principle of environmental design. If you want to transform, you must build a world that supports the person you're becoming. Remove the triggers of your past self. Add visual cues for the new one. Surround yourself with people who see your potential, not just your history. Because every sensory input, every conversation, every sound, every space is shaping your neural wiring, whether you notice it or not. You can't plant new seeds in toxic soil and expect them to thrive. But the deeper layer of transformation isn't about the outer world at all. It's about what you allow yourself to believe internally. Because beliefs aren't just thoughts you think. They're instructions your brain gives to your body. When you believe you can't change, your nervous system prepares for failure before you even begin. When you believe you're capable, your physiology shifts. Your heart rate, your posture, your focus all begin to align with that inner certainty. It's not magic. It's the biology of expectation. The brain responds to what it believes to be true. This is why visualization and affirmation, when done with emotional conviction, actually have measurable effects. Neuroscientists have found that imagining yourself performing an action activates nearly the same brain regions as physically doing it. The more vividly you rehearse a new identity, the more your brain starts to recognize it as familiar, and the less resistance you feel when you act on it in reality. You become, quite literally, what you practice being. Still, transformation isn't about pretending. It's about embodying. Pretending says, I'm something I'm not. Embodying says, I'm learning to live as what I already am beneath the noise. Because deep down, the human psyche doesn't crave to become someone new. It craves to return to the version of itself that was always whole but forgotten. That's the paradox of self-transformation. It feels like becoming someone different, but in truth, it's the process of remembering who you really are when fear and conditioning no longer dictate your choices. Many philosophers have described this process through the lens of the false self, the persona you construct to survive in the world. As children, we adapt. We learn what earns love, what avoids rejection. We create a mask that fits into our surroundings. But eventually, that mask becomes suffocating. It limits your expression, your truth, your freedom. The journey of transformation begins when you stop identifying with that mask. You start asking, who am I beneath what I was taught to be? That question alone can dismantle decades of psychological conditioning. In therapeutic contexts, this is sometimes referred to as ego death, not in a dramatic sense, but as the gradual loosening of identification with the constructed self. You stop defending your opinions so fiercely. You stop needing to be right. You stop trying to prove your worth. You begin to observe your thoughts instead of becoming them. And from that perspective, transformation starts to feel less like effort and more like unfolding. The more you release, the more space you create for something authentic to emerge. But even authenticity is not a fixed state. It's fluid and adaptive. Who you are today is not who you were 5 years ago. And that's not a contradiction, it's evolution. The psychology of self-transformation recognizes that identity itself is dynamic. Every belief, every experience, every emotional breakthrough rewrites a piece of your internal story. So rather than chasing a final version of yourself, transformation invites you to live in alignment with your current truth, knowing it will continue to change as you do. Still, transformation requires courage, not the cinematic kind, but the quiet, consistent kind that shows up even when no one's watching. Because changing yourself means disappointing some versions of your past, and sometimes disappointing people who still identify with those versions. You'll face misunderstanding. You'll lose certain connections. You might even question your own sanity at times. That's normal. Growth often looks like loss before it looks like liberation. But what you lose in comfort, you gain in clarity. There's also a psychological law that rarely gets mentioned, the law of emotional conservation. It suggests that suppressed emotions don't disappear. They transform into patterns, projections, or even physical tension. When you finally decide to transform, all those stored emotions rise to the surface. That's why it feels turbulent. It's not that you're breaking, it's that your mind is releasing what it's been holding. The tears, the confusion, the fatigue, these are not signs of weakness. They're signs that the old emotional backlog is being processed. Every release creates space for renewal. And with each release, your relationship with time changes. The future no longer feels like something distant you're chasing. It begins to feel like something unfolding naturally from the choices you make in the present. That's a major psychological shift from striving to allowing, because once you stop trying to become someone, you start being someone. You act in alignment rather than from desperation. And ironically, that's when change happens faster. The moment you stop chasing transformation is often the moment you embody it. Now, it's important to note that transformation isn't always visible to others. Sometimes it looks like stillness, silence, even withdrawal. You may spend months reflecting, reading, journaling, simply observing. To the outside world, it might look like you're stuck, but internally, your neural pathways are reorganizing. Your subconscious beliefs are being rewritten. Growth doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes the deepest revolutions happen quietly in the background of your daily life. And when the new self finally stabilizes, it feels familiar in a strange way. You don't feel like you've become someone new. You feel like you've come home. The constant inner conflict softens. The things that used to trigger you lose their power. You start responding with calm instead of defensiveness. You speak honestly without rehearsing. You move through the world with a sense of groundedness that doesn't depend on outcomes. That's psychological maturity, not the absence of pain, but the presence of perspective. From a neuroscientific point of view, this stage corresponds to increased coherence between the emotional and rational centers of the brain, the limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex. It's the integration of emotion and reason, instinct and awareness. Your reactions become choices. Your impulses become insights. You stop being driven by unconscious patterns and start living with conscious intent. That's what psychologists mean when they talk about self-regulation and inner alignment. But even here, transformation continues because the self is not a destination. It's a process of continuous adaptation. You'll keep evolving as new challenges arise, as new layers of awareness open. Transformation isn't a ladder, it's a spiral. You revisit the same lessons at higher levels of consciousness. The difference is each time you return, you meet them with more wisdom, more patience, and less fear. There's a line from the psychologist Viktor Frankl that captures this perfectly. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. That's the essence of transformation. Realizing that external control is limited, but internal evolution is infinite. You may not be able to control what happens to you, but you can always control what it means to you. And that shift in meaning is what gives pain its purpose. So, if you find yourself standing at a threshold, uncertain, afraid, unsure who you're becoming, know that it's part of the process. Confusion is not failure. It's the space between identities. It means the old structure is dissolving, and something new is taking shape. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to stay awake through the transition. Awareness is the bridge between what was and what will be. Eventually, there comes a point where transformation is no longer something you do. It becomes the way you live. You stop needing drastic change because your life itself becomes a state of continuous renewal. You outgrow without forcing. You learn without trying. You heal without rushing. And in those quiet moments, you begin to understand that transformation was never about becoming extraordinary. It was about realizing that being ordinary but conscious is extraordinary enough. The psychology of self-transformation, then, is not about chasing perfection. It's about cultivating awareness, compassion, and truth. It's about aligning your internal world so deeply that your external world begins to reflect it naturally. It's about learning to walk through the unknown without needing guarantees. Because life in its essence is a series of transformations from innocence to experience, from fear to understanding, from self-protection to self-expression. And if you look closely, you'll see that every ending you've survived wasn't really an ending at all. It was an initiation. Every heartbreak, every failure, every moment of despair was life's way of shaping you into someone capable of greater depth. The person you are becoming is not the result of luck or motivation. It's the result of every choice you've made to face yourself honestly when it would have been easier to hide. That's what transformation truly is. Not a single breakthrough, but a lifelong conversation between the person you've been and the person you're still becoming. It's not glamorous, it's not easy, but it's real. And in the end, that's all that matters, to live a life that is true, aware, and awake enough to say, I didn't just exist. I evolved.